My name is Emily. I am 34 years old, and I work as a nurse. Last month, I attended my stepsister's wedding dinner. I wore a simple dress and tried to stay quiet. But during the reception, my stepsister stood up, pointed at me, and laughed. "This is my stepsister," she told the groom's family. "She's just a useless nurse." A few people at the table chuckled. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled. But then the groom's father suddenly started staring at me very carefully, like he had seen my face somewhere before. After a few seconds, he leaned forward and said slowly, "Wait, aren't you the nurse who?" He stopped mid-sentence, and in that moment, the entire table went dead silent. Before I tell you what actually happened, please like and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The wedding reception was already loud when I arrived. Music was playing, glasses were clinking, and people were laughing around large decorated tables. My stepsister Lily had always loved attention, and tonight, she had all of it. The hall was beautiful. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling, white flowers covered the tables, and in the center of everything Lily stood in her bright white dress, smiling like she owned the entire room. I stood near the entrance for a moment, holding my small gift box. I had chosen a simple dress for the night. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive, just something comfortable. I wasn't really expecting anyone to notice me. To be honest, that's how it had always been with Lily and me. We grew up in the same house, but our lives were very different. After my father passed away, my mother remarried Lily's father. From the outside, we became one family. But inside the house, things were never that simple. Lily had everything growing up: private schools, luxury vacations, designer clothes. Meanwhile, I worked part-time jobs through college and eventually became a nurse. I never complained about it. I loved my job. Helping people, caring for strangers during their worst moments, it gave my life meaning. But Lily always saw things differently. To her, success meant money, status, and appearances. And tonight, her wedding had all of those things. Waiters moved through the room carrying trays of champagne. A small band played soft music near the dance floor, and everywhere I looked there were people dressed in expensive suits and sparkling jewelry. I quietly walked toward the reception tables. Some relatives waved politely when they noticed me, while others barely looked up from their conversations. I didn't mind. I found an empty seat near the end of one of the long tables and sat down. From there, I could see Lily moving through the crowd. She looked happy, really happy. Her groom, Mark, stayed close beside her, introducing her to different guests. Mark seemed like a decent man from what little I knew, calm, polite, and very different from Lily's usual personality. After about 20 minutes, the dinner service began. Guests slowly returned to their seats, plates were placed on the tables, and the room filled with the sound of forks and quiet conversations. That's when Lily suddenly stood up from her chair. She tapped her glass with a spoon, and the soft ringing sound spread across the room. "Everyone," she called happily. The conversation slowly faded. "I want to introduce someone to Mark's family." She turned her head and looked directly at me. I felt dozens of eyes follow her gaze, and my stomach tightened a little. "Emily," Lily said loudly, waving her hand toward me. "Come here for a second." I wasn't expecting that, but refusing would only make things awkward. So I stood up and walked toward the main table while guests watched quietly as I approached. Lily placed a hand on my shoulder when I reached her. Her smile looked friendly, but I knew that smile. I had seen it many times growing up. It was the smile she used right before making a joke at someone else's expense. She turned toward the groom's family sitting nearby. "This," she said, gesturing toward me, "is my stepsister." Then she laughed lightly. And before anyone asks, she paused just long enough to build attention. "She's just a nurse." A few people at the table chuckled politely. Someone even muttered, "Oh, that's nice." I felt the familiar wave of embarrassment rise in my chest, but I kept my face calm. I simply smiled. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with Lily only made things worse, so I stayed quiet. For a moment, the conversation around the table continued. People picked up their glasses again, and someone changed the subject. I thought that would be the end of it. But then something unexpected happened. Across the table, the groom's father suddenly stopped eating. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes. At first I thought he was just listening to the conversation, but then I noticed something strange. He was staring directly at me. Not casually, not politely. He was studying my face, like he was trying to remember something important. For a moment, the conversation at the table continued normally. Glasses clinked, people talked about the food, and someone nearby laughed loudly at a joke. But the groom's father looked distracted. He slowly placed his fork down and leaned back in his chair, still thinking about something. Mark noticed the change in his father's expression. "Dad, everything okay?" he asked. The older man nodded, but his attention still seemed somewhere else. "Yes, I'm fine," he said quietly. Then he looked around the table for a moment, almost like he was organizing his thoughts. Lily didn't notice any of this. She was busy talking about the honeymoon plans. "We're going to Italy first," she said excitedly. "Rome, then the Amalfi Coast. I told Mark we deserve something unforgettable." Several guests smiled and congratulated them again. The waiter returned and began serving the next course. Plates were replaced, fresh glasses were filled, and the music from the band became a little louder as the evening continued. Everything looked like a normal wedding reception, but the groom's father still seemed thoughtful. After a moment, he turned slightly toward Mark again. "Son," he said quietly, "what did she say her stepsister's name was?" Mark glanced toward me. "Emily." The older man repeated the name slowly. He seemed to test the name in his mind, like it was connected to an old memory. Lily laughed lightly. "Oh, don't worry about Emily," she said with a playful smile. "She spends most of her life inside hospitals." More polite chuckles came from a few guests, but the groom's father didn't react to the joke. Instead, he turned slightly toward me. Not accusing, not suspicious, just curious. For a moment, he looked like someone searching through old memories. Then he spoke slowly. "I'm sorry," he said politely. "Have we met somewhere before?" The question caught me off guard. I shook my head slightly. "I'm not sure," I replied. "I meet a lot of people through work." He nodded slowly, thinking, "That makes sense." He looked down at the table again. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to say something else. But he stopped, like the answer was still just out of reach. Across the table, Mark leaned closer to his father. "You really think you recognize her?" he asked quietly. The older man shrugged. "I don't know," he admitted. "There's just something familiar." Lily waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please," she said with a laugh. "Emily's not famous." A few guests smiled awkwardly, but this time the laughter felt forced because the groom's father was still thinking. He rubbed his chin slowly, then looked back at me again. Not intensely this time, just thoughtfully. "Strange," he murmured. "I feel like I've seen you during a very important moment in my life." The table grew a little quieter. Even Lily stopped talking for a second. But before anyone could ask more questions, the band suddenly started playing a louder song. Guests nearby clapped, and several people stood up and walked toward the dance floor. The attention of the room slowly shifted away from our table again. Lily quickly stood up as well. "Perfect," she said cheerfully. "Time for dancing." She grabbed Mark's hand and pulled him toward the dance floor. Other guests followed. Within a few minutes, most of the room was focused on music, laughter, and dancing. But the groom's father stayed seated for a moment longer. He looked at the dance floor, then back at me, still thoughtful, still searching his memory. Finally, he stood up slowly and said something that made my curiosity grow even stronger. "I'm sure of one thing," he said quietly. "We definitely met somewhere important." Then he walked toward the dance floor to join the others. And for the rest of the evening, I kept wondering what moment he was trying to remember. The music in the hall grew louder. Guests were laughing, dancing, and raising their glasses. For a while, the strange moment at the table seemed to fade away. But I could still feel the groom's father thinking about something. Even from across the room, I noticed him glancing in my direction a few times while people danced around him, almost like a memory was slowly coming back. About 20 minutes later, the band stopped for a short break. People returned to their seats, catching their breath and drinking water. The groom's father walked back to the table and sat down again. This time, he looked more certain, like something in his mind had finally connected. He looked at me again, but now there was recognition in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly. "Emily," he said slowly. "Yes," I replied. For a second, he didn't speak. Then he asked something that made the entire table pause. 3 years ago, were you working at St. Mary's Hospital?" My heart skipped. "Yes," I answered carefully. The older man exhaled slowly, like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. "I knew it," he whispered. Mark looked confused. "Knew what, Dad?" The groom's father turned toward his son. His voice was calm but emotional. 3 years ago," he said, "I was in a terrible car accident." The room grew quiet around us. "I was rushed to the emergency room in critical condition," he continued. He paused. The roads were blocked that night because of a massive protest downtown. Most of the doctors were delayed trying to get to the hospital. Several guests leaned closer, listening. For nearly 6 hours, he continued slowly, there was only one nurse who stayed with me. He pointed gently toward me. That nurse was Emily. The table went completely silent. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. He continued speaking, his voice filled with gratitude. She monitored my breathing, checked my pulse, kept talking to me so I wouldn't lose consciousness. He looked at Mark. If she had walked away even once, I might not have survived until the doctors arrived. Mark stared at me in shock. "You saved my dad." I shook my head slightly. I was just doing my job. But the groom's father shook his head firmly. "No," he said. "You did much more than that." He turned slowly toward Lily, and his expression changed. The warmth in his voice disappeared. "You introduced her as just a nurse," he said calmly. The room was silent now. No one left. No one moved. "You shouldn't say just a nurse about someone who saves lives." Lily's face turned pale. For the first time that evening, she had nothing to say. The groom's father looked back at me. "If it wasn't for you," he said quietly, "I wouldn't be sitting here today watching my son get married." Mark stood up from his chair and walked around the table toward me. Then he extended his hand. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I mean that." Some of the guests began whispering softly. Others looked embarrassed about laughing earlier. One older woman near the table even shook her head at Lily disapprovingly. I suddenly felt very uncomfortable being the center of attention, so I smiled politely. Like I said, I told them, I was just doing my job. But the groom's father spoke again. "And you did it better than anyone could have." The band started playing music again in the background. The reception slowly returned to its usual energy. But something had clearly changed. People now looked at me differently. Not as the quiet stepsister in a simple dress, but as someone who had done something meaningful. Meanwhile, Lily stayed unusually quiet for the rest of the evening. Her earlier confidence was gone. And for the first time in many years, she avoided looking directly at me. Sometimes, the loudest moments in life don't come from revenge. They come from quiet truth finally being seen. And that night, an entire room learned something important. Never underestimate someone just because of their job, especially when that job is saving lives.